Thank you. Revelation chapter 18, beginning at verse 1, 1333 in your old Geneva Bibles. We'll be looking at verses 1 to 24. It concerns the end of the papacy and how those nations that had once supported the papacy will react to the downfall of the papacy. Revelation chapter 18, verse 1. And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, so that the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried out mightily with a loud voice, saying, it is fallen, Babylon, that great city, and has become the habitation of devils, and the hold of all foul spirits, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunken of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich of the abundance of her pleasures. And I heard another voice from heaven say, go out of her, my people, that ye may not be partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. For her sins are come up into heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Reward her, even as she hath rewarded you, and give her double according to her works. And in the cup that she hath filled to you, fill her the double. Inasmuch as she glorified herself and lived in pleasure, so much give ye to her torment and sorrow. For she saith in her heart, I sit being a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no mourning. Therefore shall her plagues come at one day, death and sorrow and famine, and she shall be burnt with fire. For that God which condemneth her is a strong Lord. And the kings of the earth shall bewail her, and lament for her which have committed fornication, and lived in pleasure with her, when they shall see that smoke of that her burning, and shall stand afar off for fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and wail over her, for no man buyeth their ware any more. The ware of gold and silver, and of precious stone, and of pearls, and of fine linen, and of purple, and of silk, and of scarlet, and of all manner of fine wood, and of all vessels of ivory, and of all vessels of most precious wood, and of brass, and of iron, and of marble, and of cinnamon, and odors, and ointments, and frankincense, and wine, and oil, and fine flour, and wheat, and beasts, and sheep, and horses, and chariots, and servants, and souls of men. And the apples that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee, and all things which were fat and excellent are departed from thee, and thou shalt find them no more. The merchants of these things which were waxed rich shall stand afar off from her, for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, and gilded with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour so great riches are come to desolation. And every shipmaster and all the people that occupy ships and shipmen and whosoever traffic on the sea shall stand afar off, and cry when they see that smoke of that her burning, saying, what city was like unto this great city? And they shall cast dust on their heads and cry, weeping and wailing, and say, alas, alas, that great city wherein they were made rich, all that had ships on the sea by her coastlines, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. O heaven, rejoice of her, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God hath punished her, to be revenged on her for your sakes. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone, and cast it into the sea, saying, with such violence shall that great city Babylon be cast, and shall be found no more. And the voice of harpers and musicians, and of pipers and trumpeters shall be heard no more in thee. And no craftsman of whosoever craft he be shall be found any more in thee. And the sound of a millstone shall be heard no more in thee. And the light of the candle shall shine no more in thee. And the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, and with thine enchantments were deceived all nations. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. Title of our message this morning, Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 to 24, the end of the papacy and her support. Our text this morning is a future event, but one that will probably occur in the lifetime of many sitting here today. It concerns the final days of the papacy. The text spells out in some detail how the final days of the papacy will appear. It paints a picture of an aging harlot who still thinks she yields power but has become burdensome to her idolatrous lovers. Her former lovers are content to stand aloof while she makes her final end. She meets her final end. There are 3 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 8, the final days of papal Rome. Verses 9 to 19, the economic downfall of Rome. Verses 20 to 24, the elect rejoice at the fall of Rome. Our context. In the 17th chapter of Revelation, last week we looked at this, the Antichrist was identified and her crimes published. Once revealed, it will only be a matter of time before her days are over. Here we do not only have the fall of the papacy, but the reaction of all the European nations to its fall. The Roman papacy will have few friends when she meets her final end. The nations of the world will watch her burn and offer no help as the papacy comes to its final end. And that's what we'll see in our verses today. We come to our first point, verses 1 to 8, the final days of papal Rome. Verse 1. And after the papacy had been revealed in chapter 17, I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, so that the earth was lightened with his glory. So here we have another angel coming down from heaven. We've had many. But this is no ordinary angel. This angel is likely Christ in his mediatorial character. We know this is probably Christ because this angel brightens the earth with his glory and comes in power. Christ's coming is going to put a final end to the papacy and have a positive effects upon all the nations. Verse 2, and he, that is the angel, cried out mightily with a loud voice, saying, it is fallen, Babylon, that the great city, and has become the habitation of devils, and the hold of all foul spirits, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. The message of this angel is that Babylon is fallen, though it is not yet fallen. It is said to be fallen because in a very little time after Christ makes this declaration, it will fall. In the last chapter, it was revealed that Rome is actually the Babylon, the great city, or what we might call mystical Babylon. We notice that Rome here has become the habitation of devils. Devils have doctrine, right? Meaning the doctrine of the Roman papacy is the devil's own invention, and it's an apostasy. The Pope and his cardinals, priests, Jesuits, monks, and friars possess the spirit of devils, or unclean spirits, as called here, such as do demons. The mess within the papal walls is compared here to the ugly, desolate, and uninhabited and abandoned places of where the most hateful birds like vultures reside. In other words, in this verse, the papacy is being compared to an old abandoned building filled with unclean and horrible birds. Verse 3. For all nations have drunken of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. And the merchants of the earth are waxed rich of the abundance of her pleasures. So the kings of the earth, which are the European nations that once were enriched, once loved the papacy. But now we're in the final days. Remember, it is also, we learned in chapter 17, that these same 10 kings that the papacy gave their power to will also be the ones that turn on the papacy and destroy them. We're just waiting for countries like France and Spain to do that. These European nations have joined with the papacy in her idolatrous worship and practices, and they've encouraged their subjects to do the same. The purpose of this verse points out the great scope of the Roman Church's dominion, especially in Europe. There is no continent where the papacy is not welcome and where the papacy is not granted some power of political and religious influence. These merchants are really what we might call ecclesiastical merchants, have not sold actual goods and enriching themselves, but became enriched by selling the souls of men. These people that have become rich by having association with the Catholic Church, they deal in the merchandise of men. They pretend to sell men heaven, as the papacy does, and the salvation of their souls. They enrich themselves with the papacy, selling pardons and indulgences to the ignorant who don't know any better. And for a sum of money, they'll even say the Mass to release souls out of purgatory. All things have been saleable at Rome. Crucifixes, priests, altars, temples, prayers, heaven, even Christ. And people have become rich off of doing that. That's going to cease. Verse 4. And I heard another voice from heaven say, Go out of her, my people, that ye may not be partakers of her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues. So now John hears another voice which warns everyone to flee the papacy before its destruction comes. By now, every true Christian should have separated themselves from the papacy. Although many are still deceived that may in the future or are God's elect. Or there may be some elect still in the Catholic Church that have not yet been converted. God's giving them a final warning in this time, somewhere in the near future. For those elect still in the Roman Church, the time to leave will be now, when Christ says that. But this is also a warning to any nation that has propped up the Antichrist or has befriended the Pope and Rome. Those who do not fully break with Rome are all going to be in harm's way when Rome gets destroyed. So if you have some kind of treaty with Rome or something, you're not going to get paid. Verse 5. So break ties with Rome everywhere. Don't buy a house there. Don't buy real estate there. Verse 5. For her sins are come up unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. God has set a limit on the iniquity of individuals and nations. The analogy here is that in every generation, the papacy has piled up more and more sins. This pile keeps getting higher. The pile eventually becomes so high that heaven takes notice. All nations and empires are given a fixed amount of time to make their case before God, whether they should survive. But when they do not serve the Creator, they provoke the wrath of God. They call down vengeance on themselves, and they are asking for God's judgment. God does not usually judge at the first infraction, but there is a limit, and no one can know God's limit, so don't push His limit. We never know exactly where the line is, but when we reach that limit, God says, Away from me, I never knew you. Now God tells the Roman papacy that they have reached their limit. Nations rise and fall. Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Italy, Spain, France, Germany. All of them had their chance to be at the top of world power sometime in history. And they all lost it. They all fell. They all piled up sins against God. And then they all ran out of time. They all piled their iniquities too high. And now Rome is said to do the same. Verses 6, 7, and 8. Reward her even as she hath rewarded you, and give her double according to her works. This is telling the nations to destroy the papacy. And in the cup that she has filled to you, fill her the double. Inasmuch as she glorified herself and lived in pleasure, so much give ye to her torment and sorrow. For she saith in her heart, I sit being a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no mourning. Therefore shall her plagues come at one day, death and sorrow and famine, and she shall be burned with fire. For strong is the Lord which will condemn her. So the limit of the iniquity of Rome will soon be reached. Because the papacy's crimes have been specifically against Christ's church, she will receive double the torment that she placed upon others, possibly at the hand of the Protestants who abused her. That's my guess. This is God's sentence against Rome. Nations and empires cannot pay for their sins for all eternity as people do. I'll say that again. Nations don't pay for their sins for all eternity like people do. Although the individuals in an empire can spend time in hell. God doesn't send a nation to hell, in other words. So nations have to be punished differently. Nations get destroyed while on earth in order to show the rest of the world that their limit is past. They will always get back more than they've done, by the way. The papal harlot here is shown sitting upon her throne, thinking herself invincible. Her crime is her pride, her presumption, and her security in her own wealth. She has acted the proud and haughty part in exalting herself above all emperors, kings, and princes, above all kingdoms and states, and also above all churches, assuming arrogant titles and blasphemous names. When she says she is no widow, it means she believes she will never be in need or in mourning state as a widow. but she's mistaken. For her crime she will be punished. She will be burned like a priest's harlot, as the law required, and she is not to be pitied. We come to our second point, verses 11 to 19, the economic downfall of Rome. Verses 9 and 10. And the kings of the earth shall bewail her and lament for her, which have committed fornication and lived in pleasure with her, when they shall see the smoke of her burning, and shall stand afar off for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, the great city of Babylon, the mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. When kings of the earth are left to bewail and lament for Rome, which kings of the earth are left to bewail and lament for Rome is unclear. For we know that the same kings that gave her power will also be those who cause her destruction. Maybe some nations will still pity Rome for sentimental reasons. Maybe some nations will say, well, it's a shame that Rome has to die because he really made us rich, but what are you going to do? However, all those that committed fornication with the papal harlot will not be able to lend their support to the papacy when she falls. All they can do, you notice what it says, is stand afar off. They're just going to watch it happen. They're not going to help. During the 1260 years, they propped up Antichrist. But when Antichrist is fallen, all their strength will be gone to help. They will not be able to help. These European nations will no longer have the desire for help, for fear that they'll be implicated in the crimes of the papacy. All they can offer is to bewail and lament for her. But no help will come. It will also be a very swift judgment. You'll notice here it's called 1 hour. Now, if a day is a year, an hour is a 24th of a year. So expect half a month for it to take to watch Rome burn. Verse 11. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and wail over her, for no man buyeth their ware any more. People will no longer be deceived by the mystery of iniquity. These are the ecclesiastical merchants, those who sold salvation and pardons and were enriched doing it. The nations will no longer be deceived into buying into Romish merchandise like candles and rosaries and beads and indulgences and various other means by which Rome is supported. The papacy will dry up when they can no longer extort money out of people for sins forgiven or for allowing a loved one out of purgatory when nobody believes it anymore. Where's their income going to come from? Verses 12, 13, and 14. The ware of gold and silver and of precious stone and of pearls and of fine linen and of purple and of silk and of scarlet and all the manner of Thyian wood and of all the vessels of ivory and of all the vessels of most precious wood and of brass and of iron and of marble and of cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine and oil and fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and servants and souls of men. They snuck that one in there, didn't they? And the apples that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee. Italy is famous for apples, by the way. And all things which were fat and excellent are departed from thee, and thou shalt find them no more. So these false teachers have merchandised the souls of men. They've turned the church into a bank to enrich itself. It has authority and power based on the false notion that they're caring for the souls of its people, but they really have only been enriching themselves with the doctrines of devils. They've been involved in economic commerce for a very long time. In fact, the papacy owns stock. They engage in trade. Its bank is conducted in complete secrecy and engages in all kinds of nefarious, that means evil, economic activities, mostly hidden from the public. They used to make pharmaceuticals, by the way. They actually made a fortune off of birth control pills, which they publicly condemn and then charge Catholics for taking them, right? For sinning by taking the products that they made. It's never been a church. It's always been a quasi-political economic harlot. Here's the Roman papacy for you. Each of the elements in these verses has something in common with the idolatry of the papacy, you may have noticed. The gold they peddled is for use in the Pope's hat and crown. The fine linen can be found in their papal robes and the robes of the cardinals. The extravagant woods and ivory were used in cathedral furniture, while everybody else was destitute and poor, right? The costly vessels were used for holy water. Marble and other valuable stones were used for baptism. Censers of iron and brass were made for burning incense. Cinnamon, odors, ointments, and frankincense were used for burning incense in imitation of incense under the law. No reason to do that anymore. By the way, Many of these things are the same things used by the papacy, are the same thing that harlots use. You know how harlots always have like the mother harlot who just sits like a queen and divvies things out? It's just like the Pope is being described as the mother harlot who sends the girls off to do their harlotry while she sits like a queen in charge of the whole thing. It's exactly how the Pope's being described. Could you think of a better example? Verses 15 and 16. The madam, they call her. She's like the madam of the Catholic Church. The merchants of these things which were waxed rich shall stand afar off from her, for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, and gilded with gold and precious stones and pearls. Many nations, here called merchants, grew rich by their affiliation with the papacy. These countries profited by selling the salvation of the Roman Church. Just not Rome got rich selling these indulgences, the countries did too. But they also grew rich in other ways. For instance, the French grew rich supplying the papacy with horses and chariots. The Swiss provided servants, and many countries provided armies, all which were paid and rewarded by the papacy. Those who dealt with the papacy during its height enriched themselves. But when the end of the papacy comes, we see these same merchants who enriched themselves by being friends with papal Rome, now standing aloof. They will regret the loss of income they received when they were in partnership with the papacy, but now they stand afar off, crying over their lost income. Verses 17 and 18. You know, when Rome falls, it's not going to be the time of the Christianization of nations yet. There will be Armageddon and then the Christianization of the nations. So they're going to lament the fall of Rome and the loss of income because they're not going to be converted yet. The nations won't be converted. So that's what we're looking at here. Verses 17 and 18. For in 1 hour, here we have the hour again, so great riches are come to destruction. And every shipmaster and all the people that occupy ships and shipmen and whosoever traffic on the sea shall stand afar off and cry when they see the smoke of her burning, saying, What city was like unto this great city? The shipmasters and merchants are those who once profited from Rome and its economic and spiritual system. We notice again how quickly Rome will fall. Here we get a glimpse of the merchants, once enriched by Rome, standing in the distance and lamenting. The smoke-burning Rome is so large that wherever they can see the smoke, wherever they are, they can see the smoke of Rome's burning. We have the type of words that they will speak while they're watching Rome burn. They will reminisce with words like, What city was like unto this great city? 19. And they shall cast dust on their heads and cry, weeping and wailing, and say, Alas, alas, the great city, wherein were made rich all that had ships on the sea by her costliness, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. The casting of dust on their heads, of course, is a gesture for mourning. These merchants who are wailing are all those who got their living by serving this mystical Babylon, all who will be highly concerned in the ruin of the papacy, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and priests. They're the ones going to be wailing. You're going to have to find real jobs. These men all got the best of lands into their possession for their own private use or for their abbeys and their monasteries. They profited from pardons and indulgences and absolutions and saying mass, praying souls out of purgatory, all which are costly. And hereby these traitors in religions have been enriched. And now the remembrance of these things of which they will be deprived will affect and grieve them, as well as the suddenness of Rome's ruin. Now we get to the fun part. Verses 20 to 24. The elect rejoice at the fall of Rome. Verse 20. O heaven, rejoice of her, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God hath given your judgment on her. This is said by the same voice from heaven which earlier called upon all saints to come out of Babylon. Verse 4. And to take vengeance on her. Now the same voice calls upon all good men to rejoice at her ruin. While the papists are wailing, we, the church of God's elect, both militant on earth and triumphant in heaven, are commanded to rejoice. Because when God pours out his vengeance upon his and our enemies, the church on earth is advanced. The church in heaven is avenged. What is left of the confessing church at the end of the apostasy will rejoice. Verse 21. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, With such violence shall the great city Babylon be cast and shall be no more. Babylon being Rome. Now John sees a mighty angel symbolically casting a millstone. into the sea, and saying, with such violence shall that great city, Rome, be thrown down and shall be found no more. This indicates a violent end to mystic Babylon, or Rome. This is the ending, by the way, we should expect. The papacy advanced itself against the true church by violence and therefore must be destroyed by double the violence. Verse 22 and 23. And the voice of harpers and musicians and of pipers and trumpeters shall be heard no more in thee, and no craftsman of whatsoever craft he be shall be found any more in thee, and the sound of a millstone shall be heard no more in thee, and the light of a candle shall shine no more in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more in thee, for thy merchants were the great men of the earth, and with thy enchantments were deceived all nations. So this is the casting down, you might have noticed, of all false worship within the papist church. Did you notice all those things referred to their blasphemous worship? The destruction of all its images, and those who make them won't have jobs anymore. Statues, music, paintings, we call icons, and all other pieces of idolatry will be completely overthrown. This is the end of organ church music. Hopefully the Protestants will stop doing it too. It's the end of bells and other instruments of music used in man-centered papal worship. There will be no more chanters and choirs, Protestant churches. There will be no more worshiping idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, and the works of men's hands. The millstone is a figure used to grind, is a real thing, used to grind corn, but it's a figure of something that makes food, and food, they were used to the fat of food. That'll be gone to punish their gluttony. There will be no more candles to light the dark in the darkness to punish them for the use of candles in the Mass and their prayers for the dead. That's why he's taking these things away symbolically. There will be no more marriage among them. Now, why would he take marriage away? Because they have destroyed marriage by forbidding marriage. So what we see is God's taking away the things that they didn't know how to use right, like candles and food and marriage. Verse 24. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. In the rubbish of Rome, when destroyed, will be found the blood of all those holy servants of God, whether ministers of the gospel or professors of it, who have since the year 606, when the Pope first came to power, have been put to death for the testimony of Christ. No religion has killed more followers of the true religion than the papacy. In fact, the Roman papacy has killed more real Christians than all the other religions and enemies of Christianity combined. All the enemies of the church have not killed as much of the true church as Catholics have killed. The destruction of Antichrist and Islam must happen first, then we can expect Armageddon, after which will follow the conversion of nations and the millennial reign of Christ. Next week we read in great detail about the celebration of the church over the destruction of the papacy. Let us pray. Lord our God, may we continually be taught and look forward to that day, having no pity for those who have killed the true church and have spent 1,260 years railing against the true church and railing against thee. We do pray to be taught. We pray Protestant churches to be taught, especially those that imitate papal worship, man-centered worship, that they might be so taught to come out of her. For though they have come out of the papal church, they still return to the papal holidays and the papal worship. And they must entirely come out of all those things. And we do pray all these things in thy Son's name. Amen. Conclude our worship with finishing Psalm 79 to the tune of Jackson. You'll remember in 79, Israel or Jerusalem had been conquered by some foe. They realized they deserved it. In verses starting at verse 8 to the end, they will start to pray for deliverance, asking to be delivered from the heathen, promising to do better. Psalm 79 verses 8 to 13 to the tune of Jackson. Against us, mind not former sins, thy tender mercy show. Let them prevent us speedily, for we're brought very low. For thy name's glory help us, Lord, who hast our Savior been. Deliver us for thy name's sake, O purge away our sin. Why say the heathen, where's their God? Let him to them be known. When those who shed thy servant's blood are in our sight o'erthrown. Oh, let the prisoners sigh ascend before thy sight on high. Preserve those in thy mighty power that are designed to die. And to our neighbor's bosom calls its sevenfold rendered be. Even the reproach wherewith they have, O Lord, reproached thee. So we thy folk and pasture sheep shall give thee thanks always, and unto generations all we will show forth thy praise. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. Amen.